Maps you all have, but if you're looking at your maps and you see Star Fort, we're there, and we're looking now south towards Fort Milroy there. So we're directly in line with it. You can kind of see now why they built them, where they built them. We're separated geographically with the road we came in on and turned off of. That's 522 North Frederick Pike, the Pewtown Road as it's labeled. That separates this hill and the hill that Fort Milroy is on, and there's a water body that runs over there too. You see on the map that's a tributary to Redbud Run. The hill we're on though, this rise is known as Strines Hill, S-T-R-I-N-E-S. Strines Hill, that's this hill, and it rises up from the Pewtown Road 522 and runs about a mile north that direction. And it's cut in half today by modern day 37, but it keeps riding northward there, and you had a cluster of earthworks continuing north off of this fort behind you all. And obviously this is Star Fort. It doesn't look like much of a star if you can kind of make out these points. You could put 7 to 8 guns in here at the time of the Second Battle of Winchester. There's going to be 6 or less firing from here, but I just wanted to orient everybody. So that's where Fort Milroy is. We're now looking west. We're surrounded by this lovely neighborhood. And yeah, let's now step into the fort.
Are you familiar with this neighborhood?
Never been here before.
I hear the best people live here. That's what I hear.
This is true.
So if it's this big now, back then, if the girls are probably a lot taller. So you gotta think this is 160 some years of a road.
If you just want to yell at me when I'm talking too long,
We're gonna go inside the food.
Like right now?
where are you from?
The flies are like, they remind me of names.
Yeah, and the ticks get bad here this time. The deer running through here.
Where we're going next and getting out at. If you go back tomorrow, at like early morning, but don't go up to where Mike will take you guys to the next stop.
Okay.
Up there. McCann Property Carter Farm.
Yeah.
It's more than likely general area where they tried to attack and then. But if you went there at like, I don't know, 4 or 5 o'clock, like you'd be feeling it.
It would be right.
All right, so now
frame.
exactly. So now you're in Star Fort, just to kind of paint the picture of what this looks like from above. You have this long spine back here facing northeast, and then off of that back you've got where you see kind of the dips where those are artillery emplacements. So off each of those points, and where we walked up, that was man-made. I was told when they were building the neighborhood, someone came in with an excavator and pushed it out from the inside. So the original entrance is right over there, where it would have been connected to Fort Milroy by a footpath and a makeshift road. But right here would have been one of those gun emplacements there, all around here. And what they're focusing on, and I've got all the answers that the questions you might have about other history of the fort, but for time's sake, we'll just focus on 2nd Winchester. In this fort, you're going to have, I think it's Alexander's Baltimore Light Artillery. It's like F.H. Alexander's or F.W. Alexander's Baltimore Light Artillery. They've got 3-inch ordnance rifles, and they're coming on the 14th from Berryville. So before, and you set up the battle earlier at Kernstown, you got most of Ewell's force coming to Winchester. But there at Front Royal, after they cross into the Shenandoah Valley, he splits his force and sends Robert Rode's division north on the Front Royal Winchester Turnpike, modern day 522, towards a White Post and all the way up to Berryville. It's a straight shot to Berryville, because Milroy at the time has a federal force there in Berryville. That force will evacuate there and head towards Martinsburg, but that's where Robert Rode's men are headed. And the Baltimore Light Artillery is positioned there. They'll be called out, and on the 14th, the day of the action here, they'll move to this position, and they'll arrive here just in time to set up their 3-inch ordnance rifles and point them right there. So where you see the gap in the trees, and you see the woods in the distance, the far distance, just where you lose it in the fog, those trees there is the back side of where West Fort is. So those guns, that's where West Fort is. So we saw the front side of that from the Tractor Supply dealership. We're now looking at it from the federal perspective. So Jim left us off with the 110th and all those other federal detachments in there, pulling back to Star Fort, to Fort Milroy, which is a straight shot that way, and they're falling back here. Oh no, now they lost West Fort. The good thing is Milroy's men had been here for about 6 months building and re-strengthening these fortifications, that they played out worst case scenario. And worst case scenario for them is if West Fort was taken, well, they were prepared for that. So when that did happen and it came time to fire upon West Fort, the fuses were already pre-cut to know the distance, and they knew how to sight the guns exactly to West Fort. And the same would be from Fort Milroy. It's just that wasn't the case this day. Their target was West Fort. So as Early's men and the artillery ride into West Fort, capture what guns they can, supplies, they begin to start looting. The guns begin to open up here at Star Fort and Fort Milroy. Fort Milroy has a couple large siege guns actually. I mean, what is it, like 32 pound, 24 pound?
So, yeah.
Huge guns. You can actually see some of those cannonballs and those pieces of artillery projectile that were fired from those large siege guns at West Fort. Portions of them and whole versions of them were excavated through archaeology out of West Fort and are now on display at the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum downtown. So you can see some of those artifacts from this battle 162 years ago. But this is all now the artillery and the battle has renewed again. We're now firing at West Fort, back and forth here. Those men in the Baltimore Light Artillery, this is what their true baptism of fire. They felt this was it. This is the first time they're going to get engaged heavily in battle. And you can come up and look at this gentleman. You can see it from here. This is Lieutenant Peter Leary. And Lieutenant Leary wasn't thought much of by his subordinates and the men in the artillery. But it's here at this battle and this hot, heavy engagement they're working with that it's described by one of the other men in the battery. He describes Leary as a man that the men did not think much of. But Leary himself stripped off his coat and took hand in leading and firing a cannon in his shirt and sleeves, cheering and hurrahing at every successful shot. And there was many such, and our battery proved itself a good one here at Star Fort. Now, it wasn't just the Baltimore Light Artillery here in Star Fort. This fortification was surrounded by rifle pits and earthworks, and other earthworks. And in those rifle pits, you'd have the 6th Maryland Infantry, you'd have other Pennsylvania regiments, you'd have New York Cavalry is up in this vicinity as well, just kind of hanging out. Because as of now, the battle has renewed, obviously, and resumed, but it's just artillery upon artillery. Frank Wild, the gentleman that writes a good description of the fighting here at Star Fort, he says they successfully hit a caisson there at West Fort that's loaded with powder and shot, and they see it explode. It's one of the greatest scenes they had ever saw. But Frank Wild says he wants to get a better view, and he climbs this parapet right here. And then as he's looking through, trying to sight the guns and give orders to his men, he feels bullets whiz by his face. And he said it's the closest to death's door he's ever been. He said that one of the men in the battery had their legs shot off. He was taken prisoner, not to spoil it, but he was taken prisoner, and he dies the next day. Another man was wounded in the side. But one of the most fascinating things about the fighting here, I think, is the loss of horse flesh. Wild describes a beautiful black wheel horse had a piece of its throat torn out, as wide as your hand, bleeding terribly every time it exhaled. A spurt of blood came out with the air. He'd go on to describe later, after the battle kind of ceases, and he's taking shelter in one of his in the dog pen right over there by the entrance of the fort. He says he feels the flap of his tent opening up, and he thinks someone's coming in to tell him something. And it's that horse still breathing in and out bloody air out of its throat. He says he knew he was going to die. He said he put his hand over the wound, expecting it to ease him, but the blood turned into his lungs, and he had to cough up clotted blood, the sweat pouring from his shiny black body. He was trembling as if cold. His moments were few, and as our fort was too small to be encumbered with dead horses, the wounded ones were led out into the open, where lead and hail would soon finish them. And it wasn't just typical artillery fire they were receiving from the Confederates. They described a screeching, roaring sound from the projectiles being fired upon them from the Confederates. Well, that noise, this distinct noise, this screeching, was coming from railroad iron that the Confederates were firing from West Fort at this position. You have one man that's loading and firing the gun here on these gun emplacements, have a shell whiz by his face and be taken and wounded out of the battle because of concussion, as how close that artillery projectile comes to his face. They said the fighting is so hot that the men that are loading and firing these guns, these 3-inch ordnance rifles up here on these gun emplacements, are doing it on their hands and knees to keep the fire consistent but not become casualties of the Confederate fire. As it turns into night, the civilians in the town of Winchester, just through the trees here about half a mile, are climbing the rooftops of their houses, watching this nighttime artillery bombardment between Star Fort and West Fort, and Fort Milroy and West Fort, back and forth all through the night, especially with Fort Milroy, these large siege guns. A lot of these citizens had never seen anything like it, and especially at night, and they said it was an amazing spectacle to watch. But as night calms and the battle starts to calm, there's many federal accounts, and this is where the battle can get confusing to many historians today, is during the night, at some point, you get many federal accounts from here in Star Fort and here in Fort Milroy of a Confederate night attack. They say that the Confederates came out of West Fort, all those men that Early had, and bridged the gap of the open fields between West Fort and these Union fortifications and launched a night assault on the federal position. Many federal accounts of this. They said that they could hear, they couldn't see, but they could hear, they heard popping of muskets, all sorts of things. But when it comes down to it, there's no accounts from the Confederates on this, and I feel like if it was a successful attack or even a large attack as the Federals described it, the Confederates, at least one of them would have wrote something, especially in the weeks before Gettysburg, but there's not one account we can find or historians can find on this. So there's this alleged ghost attack, we'll call it now, by the Confederates at night, but it's at some point as the guns and the firing ceases, and the soldiers in here are counting up their expended rounds and seeing how much ammunition they have left. It's around 1 o'clock. They'll get the orders from high command to spike the guns and pull out. And they'll spike their pieces, they'll destroy equipment. They won't take anything with them that makes noise. They'll leave that all here in the fortification, and they'll file out around 1 o'clock in the morning out of the walls of Star Fort, more than likely straight back down this hill. We're about less than a quarter of a mile to the Valley Turnpike, or Route 11 today, that direction. We're pretty much in line with where Fort Collier is today, but about a mile separates us, with the Valley Turnpike being in between. But the Baltimore Light Artillery and other Union soldiers will filter to the Valley Turnpike and head north, because Robert Milroy, General Milroy, had had council of war that night and had ordered the general retreat of the army out of here. So they're not going to take anything with them. They'll spike the guns, and they'll start heading out. But one of the other individuals that are here in the fortifications with the Federal Army is not just soldiers themselves and wounded horses, but you also have a large amount of black population here in the fortifications, here in Star Fort and Fort Milroy. Many of these newly freed or employed African Americans for the Federal Army, as Milroy was a staunch abolitionist and he had forced the Emancipation Proclamation during his occupation here in Winchester, many of these blacks here in Winchester were frightened by the Confederate force now arriving, and their only safety they had saw in this fighting was here with the armies in the fortifications. So they sought shelter here, only taking anything but the clothes on their backs, seeking shelter here in the fortifications. And they were here all throughout that bombardment I described earlier. You had civilians fearing for their lives, hiding wherever they could in these fortifications. And as the army withdraws in the early morning of the 15th towards the Valley Pike, so too will those black civilians and other pro-Union civilians retreating with the Federal Army. And this is where it can get confusing, because now you have thousands and thousands of soldiers and horses and wagons and supplies moving northward along the Valley Pike, on top of the thousands of civilians, both pro-Union and black civilians, now getting in the way, clogging up the Valley Pike as Milroy's army is trying to evacuate Winchester and beat whatever's coming their way. So this just adds to the chaos and confusion in the early morning hours of June 15th. Are there any questions? Okay, you're standing on 17 acres of preserved ground. I'm not going to ask you for any money. You can come here anytime. We've got 5 interpretive signs throughout the park here, and it's really well supported by the neighbors at Starford. So we got Will over here, myself and my family. A great, they pay an HOA fee with that money every year. It's not an HOA; it just goes to the fort. So this fort can be restored. I mean, if you came here years ago, it was covered with trees, being overgrown. It was not good for the fortification. So through the funds of the neighbors of this neighborhood, so a lot of times development's a bad thing. In this case, we have the fort, and we have generous supporters throughout the neighborhood that help support this every year through their contributions to the county. In turn, that comes back to us. And we're able to mow, maintain, update interpretive signage, make this safer and more enjoyable park for all of you all when you come to Winchester. So, do you have a question, please?
I read that on the 15th, when a couple thousand Union troops were captured, that the Confederates brought them here to Star Fort to keep them all in one spot until they figured out what to do with them.
Great, yeah. So Winchester many times showed up to war, prison, hospital, barracks, and especially our Civil War Museum downtown. But yeah, some of these same soldiers that had spent time constructing these fortifications for the 6 months prior to this, now after they had been captured, spoiler alert, on June 15th, they're brought back to these same fortifications, and these walls they had built to protect them now confine them. So you're exactly right.
I've got a question about the battle, but is the section of limestone still here that supposedly came from Selma? And did y'all ever figure out if Selma was actually used to construct?
So
I can show them.
I can't confirm that that's right though, Pete.
Yeah, I can show them where there is some of that kind of rock protruding from the ground.
No, I know where it is. It's still there.
So yeah, what he's mentioning here is the point of when these fortifications were being rebuilt, reconstructed, or newly built. Robert Milroy, being a staunch abolitionist that he was, saw this lovely abandoned house on Amherst Street in Winchester. And he was like, God, that'd be such a perfect house to use to help build some of my fortifications and help fill the dirt. I don't need to use as much dirt if I could put rocks and bricks and stones. God, but it's just, if I had a reason to tear it down. It just so happened that that house was owned and lived in at one point in time by James Mason, Senator James Mason, who currently, I think at this point in the war, was one of 2 gentlemen representing the Confederacy in negotiations with Great Britain. So the Trent Affair, if you've ever heard of that, James Murray Mason, he's involved with that. He's he's involved with the Confederate government at this point. He was a Virginia senator, Virginia congressman before this, senator, and he helped write the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. He's the grandson of founding father George Mason. He had a home here on Amherst Street. Hadn't been in it for a while. The Army had been in and out since the war started. I think the roof was off at this point, pretty much gutted, but the brick and whatever material made up the structure of the house, Milroy saw this opportunity, dismantled it, along with a couple other abandoned buildings, and used the material from those structures to help build up these fortifications such as Milroy. So there's times we've had some minor archaeology done here. We've found pieces of brick. So I don't know where we've described it or where it's written that entire Selma house, that was the name of Murray's house, Selma, was limestone, but there's a good amount of brick deposit here in Starfort, and pieces of limestone.
Yeah, the stone foundation parts of those you can supposedly still see here.
Yeah, so up there supposedly there's some limestone footers. They use a lot of these large limestone rocks as the pads of the gun emplacements where you lay those guns on top of. One of the issues I've struggled with internally is back during the 80s, this was 1980s that is, this was a great spot for Civil War reenactors. A Civil War reenacting group owned it. And that's how it really got preserved, was it eventually got transferred to the Battlefields Foundation. But it was an artillery reenactment group that owned it. I think it was the Middlesex Artillery, and they owned it, and there's images of all the reenactments they had in here, full encampments, guns everywhere, a big flagpole. So that happened too. So my internal dilemma is, well, did those guys in the 80s bring those rocks in here? But can't confirm or deny that.
One more question.
Yeah.
There's two little holes over here. Is any of them from the magazines that would have been exploded?
So great question, Michael. So off in the left up against the wall, there's a large pit there in the ground. And then over here, there's a berm pit right near the entrance of the fort. Talked to many experts and other folks and other historians. Believe that one to be the powder magazine more than likely. And then that one could have been something else. We haven't had formal archaeology done of those, but the way this one is, the way the resource lies today with the berm and then an entrance on the other side, kind of a footpath, and how deep that goes, and then how deep the hole is, and if there was a wall, or a roof, and that caved in, how high that would be. That would definitely be some sort of structure for the fortification, whether it was a powder magazine or not. Archaeology will soon, hopefully, tell us. Any other questions?
This was mainly artillery. Was there also infantry?
Yeah, so great question. Like I had said at the beginning, with the rifle pits and earthworks surrounding the perimeter of the fort, you had like the 6th Maryland Infantry and some other infantry in those below the kind of the view of this earthwork here around the perimeter facing Confederate position. Now the rifle fire is not much for Confederate held West Fort at this point in the battle, but what ends up happening, I'm glad you brought this back up, is the 6th Maryland and these other infantry units are brought inside of the fort and now hug the walls around the gun emplacements and start using these walls as rifle pits as the artillery bombardment and potential Confederate assault becomes more imminent. They'll eventually be pulled back in and line the interior walls in the gaps between the cannons. Any other questions?
Just, we have basically one more stop and a second possible stop. And what we'd like to do is to come down out of here, take a left, and we'll go right through town and get onto Route 7. And we'll go out on Route 7 until we get to the Woods Mill Road, which goes to the left. If you put the address in once you leave here and get through town, it will bring you out to the Woods Mill Road, and then we'll take a left, and we're going to go right out to Stevenson's Depot. So we're going to go left, follow the road right around, right through town, right out to Route 7, and out to the Woods Mill Road. And once we get out there, I'll slow down at some point, and hopefully people will kind of catch up. Okay? I hate getting people on 81, so that's why I'd rather go through town.